I saw a craft hovering there that just sat there for a second and just shot straight up. That's the last I've seen of.
And then you have cases like, Betty Andreas and Luca, where, again, you have her taken, she's frozen together with her family by Greys who come into the house. This is 1960s housewife. And her and her daughter, Becky, I believe, were both taken. And initially they're handled by the Greys, who freeze the family and abduct them from the home. But then they are brought to a place where they encounter these angelic-looking Nordic beings who proceed to tell Betty that essentially they're the angels and that the little Greys are responsible for writing down all the deeds of humans. They're like a mass surveillance system that keeps a record of everybody's life. And these tall angelic beings told her that they brought Christ into the world, and don't worry, they're going to bring him back again soon. And while she was with them, and by the way, she didn't say they took her into space. They seemed to have taken her somewhere underground or underwater. And while she was there, she noticed this like doorway or large mirror or something that led toward this light. And some of these little gray entities went into the light, and they told her, you can't go in there. That's the one, that's the source. And that sent Jesus into the world and will again soon, right? So a couple of points I want to make through, these various cases. One is that we often hear these narratives where these, tall, statuesque, beautiful Nordics are pitted against these ugly little transhumanist gray robots. And, like the Eisenhower story that, Eisenhower met with the Nordics first, and then, he met with the Greys, and the Greys made him a better deal because the Nordics wanted us to get rid of our nuclear weapons. The Greys said, no, we'll give you our technology. Just let us abduct a certain number of people each year. This is extremely dubious to me, this narrative, because there are plenty of cases that attest to the fact that the Greys are some kind of a cybernetic robot that work for these Nordics. And the Nordics appear to be the ones in control. So if there's a narrative that's being promulgated of, beneficent Nordics versus like inhuman, monstrous Greys, I think it's some kind of good cop, bad cop bait and switch that's being set up here to ultimately put us in a position of captivation. And you first see this in 1950s Italy. There's a case that I cover in Closer Encounters. This guy, Bruno Sammachichia, and his associates were engaged by these Nordics who had underground bases. And they claimed, first of all, as you see with all these cases of encounters with Nordics, demonstration of tremendous psi abilities. These Nordics are all telepathic. They can perform, impressive telekinetic feats and so on and so forth. But what this Bruno Sammachichia and his associates said is that these Nordics were so benevolent, like they would never harm a fly. But they told us that there were these other entities, the Contrari, the CTR, the Contrari, who are these little robotic entities, and they're soulless, and they just want to, they want control over the human soul because they don't have souls themselves, and they're locked in a millennial battle with these beings. So this Nordics versus Grey narrative goes all the way back to the 1950s. Interestingly, Sammachichia makes a little note that, at one point it occurred to me that the SS were involved in eugenics programs, and there were rumors that after the war, these eugenics programs were continued in secret in underground facilities and so on and so forth. And I wonder whether these people that we saw, and they also saw very young people fitting this Nordic type, were basically products, outcomes of such programs that had begun in the Second World War. He engages, albeit briefly, in that kind of speculation. So, long story short, my point is that these people are integral to human history and to the development of human society. We're not dealing with something that's coming from the outside. And I'd be very suspicious of, claims by, let's say, George Adamski saying that so-and-so Furkan told him that he was from Mars, or George Van Tassel saying that he was dealing with Venusians, or Billy Meyer telling us about the, beneficent Pleiadians who are going to come to save us all, right? These beings are incredibly deceptive. I mean, deception is part of their MO. Jacques Vallée picks up on this in the context of the fairy folklore of the Middle Ages. I mean, one very consistent thing that you see in encounters with the gentry, the elite fairies in Brittany and in Ireland and so on and so forth, is that the peasants know that these beings lie all the time. They lie all the time about everything. And they only call them the good folk because otherwise they'll get pissed off and Lord knows what they'll do to you. So I think we're dealing with a faction of humanity that's positioned itself as a sort of overlord or master caste above the common herd. And they have adopted all kinds of guises and disguises to, strategically deceive us for the sake of the preservation of their control system.
How do you answer the time scale question? So you were saying, if you have millions of years ago, these, beings that looked like us existed on Mars, and then you have, Greys acting as their sort of robotic little drone emissaries. How does that necessarily answer this question of
right.
Time scale?
So the biggest problem with UFO disclosure is that the 0-point energy electrogravitic propulsion system is not just going to give you a craft that travels from New York to Australia in an hour, right? It's going to give you a flying time machine. So you remember in the 1950s, I believe you've covered the subject before, and I go into it in some depth in Closer Encounters. There were these newspaper articles quoting the chairman of Martin Aircraft, Lear Convair, saying that the G engines are coming, that we've cracked anti-gravity, and within a few years, at a cost comparable to the Manhattan Project, we can have industrial scale development of electrogravitic craft that will get you from New York to Australia in an hour. Here's the problem, though. What they didn't realize, and I think what was explained to them when they finally got the memo, is that these are flying time machines. They mess with the spatio-temporal fabric in a way that causes time dilation and time displacement. And I have this also on personal testimony, which I've told the story before, but I never revealed who told me this. In this case, I will.
Okay.
Because, man, the guy is old. And, if anyone, nobody at this point should be wanting to cause him any trouble in his life. Lynn Buchanan, in his living room, told me a story about how at one point he was taken to a Lockheed facility in California, deep underground facility. He said that it was like a shack on the side of the road. And you went into this shack and all of a sudden the floor of the place dropped. The whole thing was an elevator. And it took you down, I don't know how many hundreds of feet through solid rock. And he came out into this facility where they had reconstructed FAA style a collision between an airliner and a UFO. Like the way that FAA reconstructs airline collisions.
What do you mean reconstruct?
Like when there's been a plane crash, the FAA will lay out the pieces of the craft to emulate the moment of impact.
Whoa.
And with like little flags and stuff. And
so like a model of it?
No, they take the wreckage. They take the wreckage and they reassemble it as best they can.
So he saw a shattered UFO.
Exactly. With a civilian, I don't know if it was a civilian airliner, an aircraft, a human aircraft.
Okay.
But maybe it was a military one. I don't know. He didn't say. Anyway, they had this reconstruction. And the reason they brought him there is that they were trying to figure out how this UFO works. And there was something about the guidance system that they couldn't figure out. And they wanted him to remote view how this thing was used by the pilots. Anyway, here's the important thing, is that when he was at this facility, he says that they conveyed to him that they were training pilots to fly UFOs. I don't know whether the recovered UFOs or reverse engineered UFOs based on their design, but they were training American pilots to fly these UFOs. And the biggest problem was time displacement. that these craft would, you couldn't travel through space with them without some degree of time displacement. And that was incredibly disorienting to the pilots. So they had developed models for how much time displacement there would be based on warping of space-time by the electrogravitic drive. And they were trying to teach this to these pilots so that their brains weren't scrambled by time travel, essentially. So I have that testimony also to confirm what I think is already a very sound theoretical speculation. And Michael Masters goes into this in his book on UFOs and time travel, which I cite in Closer Encounters, that the zero-point energy drive is going to give you a time machine, not just a propulsion platform. So why do people look like, I don't know, Nordic, Olympic swimmers millions of years BC on Mars? And, how is there such a continuity, not just of the looks of the people, of the architecture? What McMoneagle and Swan saw on Mars was a style of architecture that matches the most titanic megalithic structures on Earth. And that's also the style in which that city was built on the dark side of the moon, which, Carl Wolf saw the photographs of, which Ingo Swann wandered around, through astral projection. Why is there a consistent style of architecture over millions and millions of years? Because it's not a linear temporal continuity. We are dealing with people who achieved time travel at some point. That point could be the future. Looking at it from a linear perspective, it could be 2050, it could be, 3100. At some point, time travel is achieved by a group of humans. Those humans appear to be of Nordic phenotype and genotype. Those people then began to manipulate the variables of human history hyperdimensionally. So it's not like they were Martians that once had a civilization millions of years ago on Mars, and somehow, they've gone into cryo chamber, although they did report that there were cryo chambers on Mars, and that there were people who had been left there, and they'd been waiting to be woken up, and nobody came back for them. McMoneagle said that.
These pyramidal places are like hibernation chambers. They're trying to survive until somebody comes to save them.
In any case, but I don't think that comes anywhere close to explaining the temporal continuity here. I think what we're seeing is a group of people who have learned how to drop into different epochs of human history from out of what you might loosely call a fifth dimensional frame of reference.
Interesting. And so, people talk about, it's interesting you said Nordics versus Greys. I often hear Nordics versus reptilians. So, like, are the Nordics the only faction that have some sort of transtemporal ability to time hop? Or is there some other faction that also, has plans for the Earth?
Here's what I speculate about the reptilians in Closer Encounters, okay? If you take seriously the possibility that the moon is a terraforming device and that the biosphere of this planet was radically reshaped to make it habitable for humans. Well, that would have involved also the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? So the Nordics coming here from Mars were responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, the Sumerian myths tell us that when the Anunnaki engineered a slave race on Earth, they went through several successive models.
Different parts of the brain have different activities.